Hey everyone. All right, we're continuing this Beyond the Bible series today. And yesterday we talked about should we trust the Bible, right? And I think it's funny because I always start these videos out, or I have been anyway, with something that somebody has shared on social media that has kind of been arguing against our vegan position. And yesterday I talked about the guy who said, you just got to let folks go through certain bad doctrines to get it out of your system. And, yesterday I wasn't sure if he was sharing that specifically in reference to the vegans, but I'm almost convinced. And it's funny how timely those posts are because just yesterday, right before and right as I was planning this video today about the lying pen of the scribes, this same person says the anti-meat eating teaching is just as bad as the anti-Sabbath teaching. Both are false, and they violate Torah. The anti-Sabbath teaching is slightly better because they don't deny what is written in Torah. They just say it's been abolished. But the anti-meat eating people try to blame the lying pen of the scribes, which is just a cop-out and a very bad reading of Jeremiah 8:8. And so I think it's funny that people they know that we've recognized, and Jeremiah recognized the lying pen of the scribes. That's the verse I was going to open up with. He says, they have made the law of God into a lie, the law of Yahweh. They have made it into a lie. So obviously the prophet, who you would think his words should amount to something for any Torah keeper, you would think they would amount to something, but for some reason, people don't want to hear about the lying pen of the scribes or how they have made the law into a lie. And for these people who point out vegans for using that, they don't have any better idea of what he's talking about. And as a matter of fact, they just ignore what Jeremiah says. So I think it's funny that people would point that out, but I'm not sure why, because it's like you don't even believe the words of Jeremiah. You don't think that the scribes are corrupt, even though he pointed them out clearly. And why was that? It was for making the law of Yahweh into a lie. So I don't know. We're going to look at that here in just a minute. This I don't know if you can see that, but this section is called a composite work assignment, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. Who wrote the Bible? And kind of where I left off yesterday was, or at least what I summed up yesterday, was that it's beneficial to consider other texts, even if they disagree with the Bible, because you can learn new things that we may be deceived about in the Bible. And someone even left a comment yesterday on that video that said, if you can't provide one shred of proof that the scribes added laws to the Torah, then be silent. And it's like, well, the problem is you're not willing to look outside of the Bible to see what other people had to say about it. So that, number one, that's your problem. You're not willing to research. I also talked about how using canon as the nominal gauge, and that's what canon means, is the measure, the rule of measure. That's the whole concept of canon. And that's why it was so important for people to make a canon or a rule, a nominal gauge. That's exactly what they want you to do, is use the Bible as a nominal gauge, and anything that doesn't agree with it, they want you to reject because it doesn't line up. And sure, if you're going to compare documents that line up with the Bible and they agree, that's perfectly fine. But when you use the Bible as the canon, as the nominal gauge, it assumes the canon is completely accurate. And since a lot of the stories in the Bible have been corrupt, the need to scrutinize the Bible itself, it becomes necessary when you read passages like Exodus 29, like we did yesterday. And like what we're going to do today, the hermeneutical analysis of the text, it's about recognizing intentional changes, okay, that were made to the scriptures. We're not just considering possible interpretations here, all right? It's about identifying an agenda to endorse the human behavior of killing and consuming animals, and endorsing that with scripture, okay? And most Bible believers, they're unaware that the Bible is the product of a multifaceted effort to conceal multiple truths. And of course, not everyone involved in writing the Bible had diabolical motives. The people who initially wrote it were likely just documenting their family history. Like these 4 parties that I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about 5 different parties actually who wrote the book of Moses. And most of them were just likely just writing their family history as it was handed down to them. And then later parties intruded upon the scriptures to validate their religious sacraments. So I wanted to open up with Jeremiah 8:8 and 9. And I've repeated this multiple times in my videos. Jeremiah says, "How can you say we are wise and the law of the Lord is with us? But behold, the lying pen of the scribes has made it into a lie. The wise men shall be put to shame. They shall be dismayed and taken. Behold, they have rejected the word of the Lord. So what wisdom is in them?" And I think that's pretty good. That it's, I mean, I feel like, if you can't believe the words of Jeremiah, right? I'm going to change something up so I'm not staring that way the whole time. It's like the people who point out vegans for using Jeremiah. It's like, at least we believe the words of the prophet. You guys are not willing to consider what the prophet says, right? So I'll put that back up. I don't like being so big on the screen unless you have something else to look at. All right. So if someone were to ask you, how could you prove that Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible? What would you say? Okay. How would you verify that Mosaic was the author? Could you prove Mosaic authorship? Most people can't, and it's kind of a shocking question at first. But we simply can't prove that Moses wrote the books that are commonly attributed to him. And that's the reason I refer to Mosaic law as scribal law throughout the book, and even in these videos. I don't even think it's worth calling the law of Moses anymore, just because of the Levites who were involved. And I mean, it's traditionally accepted, the idea of Mosaic authorship, but it's only an educated guess in most scholarly circles, all right? It's an assumption, okay? It's a widely accepted assumption, but it is an assumption nonetheless. And so what people don't realize is that for centuries, there have been multiple efforts to scrutinize the Pentateuch to determine the original sources. And it's like, this should be known more in the truther communities about this scholarly circle of people who have, and there's a name for it, I'll get to that in just a minute. And but it's like, most people are like, oh, I thought it was already settled that Moses wrote the Torah, right? And like many other topics among truther communities, Popular ideology is generally what dominates the mainstream, and that's what's happening here. Even in most truther circles, it's just widely accepted that Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, and it's just another one of those things that people have just accepted and added to their mental library as, that's just the way they think. And when we hear these kind of ideas that conflict with our existing beliefs, we tend to raise defensiveness, and that's what's happening. That's why people are attacked. That's why people have such a problem with vegans who question the texts, is because they've never thought outside that box. They just think, oh, everything written in the Bible is God's infallible word, which it's not. It's the product of man. Okay, but as difficult as it might be for us to consider, the fact is that many scholars have collectively analyzed the data throughout time. I mean, this goes back centuries to determine that multiple parties have contributed to the collection that we know as Torah. Okay, and that's what I'm going to talk about today in this video, is the first 5 books of the Bible. Okay. Of course, when you first begin to investigate the possibilities, skeptics, they're always going to argue that we shouldn't allow a minority group to distract us from what's already understood. We should simply accept that Moses wrote the Bible because Yahweh called him to do so. And of course, I've been accused of trusting in men because of my willingness to consider this line of research. All right. But how can someone accuse a brother of trusting in men, when the person himself trusts the men who canonized the Bible, a Catholic Bible at that, a group of people or a religious party or a religious elite group who you have even admitted is the mother harlot of Revelation, and people just know this whole the Catholic Church, or how Catholicism evolved. Okay, people understand that it is not the way of Yeshua. Okay, people get that, but then they readily accept or trust the men from that elite organization who brought us the Bible. It's a logical fallacy. And this goes back even further. These books that I'm talking about today, specifically, we're going to talk about the men who wrote those books, not just the Catholic Church who revised certain documents. I mean, we're going to get to the core of it. Who wrote the Torah? Okay. But either way, we place our trust in men when it comes to the scriptures. Okay. Some people trust the majority and tend to side with the victors of religious history and the elites and the Catholic Church. But others, like myself included, we are open to the idea that the victors have altered and concealed information throughout time. And consistent with the words of Yeshua, there is nothing hidden that will not be disclosed eventually. All right. So what's becoming more widely observed, it's the authorship of the Pentateuch. Yeah, this is one of those hidden things that is being revealed in a lot of scholarly circles these days. Okay. And a lot of what I am going to talk about today is based on this guy's research, Richard Elliott Friedman, who wrote the Bible. And he breaks it down really well in his book. And he talks about a lot of the people who have studied this in history. He brings out a lot of things that people have observed, and he just adds to it and seasons it with his own little insights. And we'll get there. But there are some legitimate observations that we have to consider. They're legitimate, okay? This is not just, oh, that's your opinion, this is your interpretation, that's your guess of, it's just a theory. But one of the most evidential clues that nothing in the Pentateuch identifies Moses as the author. That's one of the big clues, okay? There's nothing that says Moses wrote these documents, all right? The only thing we have is in Jubilees, it says an angel God commanded an angel to tell Moses to write a complete history. So everybody just assumes that Genesis through Deuteronomy, the book of Jubilees itself, these are all Moses's writings, which I don't have a problem saying Jubilees is Moses's. It's not one of those books that I've looked into making sure that he was the author. I quote Jubilees throughout Shifting the Torah Paradigm. I love the book. I think it has a lot of great insights. And but I do believe there are places in that even that book have been combed through and revised. I don't think there's any existing writing that hasn't been corrupted somehow in history, but they still give us insights of history or a version of history. Some things in Jubilees and the Pentateuch conflict with other documents. You just have to sift through them, compare and contrast to find what is the best. And you don't really have a nominal gauge other than using the concept of our loving, life-giving Creator and what was established in Genesis. Like you have to use your moral conscience that you were given, that your Creator gave you, to determine what is morally right when we read the Bible. Okay, so today we're going to look a little more, and I know I'm just kind of rambling, but we're getting there. Okay, like I said, there's nothing that says Moses was the author. If he did write the first 5 books of the Bible, then either they have not been preserved in favor of the narrative, or he simply documented blatant contradictions. There are places in the Bible that report events in a particular order, and later it would say those same events happened in a different order. It would say there were 2 of something, and some other places it would say there were 14 of that same thing. And this is what this guy brings out. He shows you first what a lot of the contradictions are, or things that appear to have been written by 2 different parties of the same account. And it's kind of like when you look at the 4 Gospels, they have the same stories written in them, but they were documented differently. And it would seem to contradict it. Okay. But yeah, like Friedman points out, it would say the Moabites did something, and later it would say that it was the Midianites who did it. It would describe Moses as going to a tabernacle in a chapter before Moses actually builds the tabernacle. Okay, things like that. And people also noticed that the 5 books of Moses included things that Moses could not have known or was not likely to have said. The text gave an account of Moses's death, for instance, and it said that Moses was the humblest man on earth. And normally we wouldn't expect the humblest man on earth to point out that he's the humblest man on earth. How humble was he really? Okay, so in his book, Who Wrote the Bible? Author, that's Richard Elliott Friedman. He goes on to reveal some of the more notable findings that scholars have observed in the span of about 600 years. Findings like the Edomite king who appears in Genesis 36, who lived much later than Moses was even alive. Okay, passages using terminology that Moses would not have been familiar with. Places mention that Moses would have never been. Okay, language that was not favorable to the time or locale of Moses's era, and an account of Moses's death, like I said. So there are just a lot of things like that. It's what he points out in the book. And among many other observations, that's just a handful that he brings out in his book. Matter of fact, the remainder of the section that I'm going over today is basically a condensed version of his book. This is kind of like a book report of what he has to bring out, but not just him. As like I said, it was this has been a line of research over the past 600 plus years. Okay, and I've done my best to capture the highlights for my readers, my viewers, to receive the full benefit, which it's hard to do. You just got to get the book and read it. At least what I'm trying to do is to capture the highlights as it pertains to the topic of study, which is anti-sacrifice and veganism. You know, the storyline of the Bible, right? Okay, getting back to Eden. And when I first started searching out the concept of biblical veganism, I bit off a larger piece than I could chew. And one of the first books that I read about, it was talking about this. You know, the dark nature of animal sacrifice. You know, that was there, but it also went into the texts upon which we depend and how they are the product of the most diabolical scheme to manipulate the minds of the readers. Okay. It was the biggest conspiracy that I've ever imagined. All right. It was bigger than the Watchers, the incursion on humanity, bigger than the Nephilim and the flat earth theory. All right. This questions the most sacred item in my religious paradigm. And that's why everybody has a problem with it. The Bible itself, this questions who wrote that. And it's funny how we can accept that there have been motives to remove or conceal or rewrite certain details and events throughout time. And we can even admit that religious authorities have revised, added, and omitted certain texts from the modern compilation that we call, that we value as sacred scripture, you know, the Bible. Even public school textbooks have been used to introduce theories to reinvent the creation design. We know there are agendas out there to hide what happened in our God. All right. I'm gonna take this back. And I'm gonna put this back over here. My eyes are getting the best of me. All right. These contacts. Anyway. Sorry, I'm just gonna have to be big. I don't like being big on the screen, but that's what's gonna happen. Okay. Anyways, like I was saying, despite our awareness of these conspiracies against the Word of God, there are limits that we have. We're willing to accept when it challenges our existing theology. If something sounds strange, right? If it doesn't agree with what we already believe, then for some reason we automatically disregard that information. But I'm here to tell you, it's worth considering that more could be concealed, all right? And contrary to popular teaching among the Christian mainstream, the Bible is not the infallible Word of God, all right? Yahweh is not the one who decided to compile 66 books into an all-inclusive canon, guys. Okay, for some reason we have this idea that God himself, he was the one who published a leather-bound King James Bible with a chapter-verse structure, and that's hardly the case. Your preferred Bible is the final product of a multifaceted process. It took thousands of years to compile, and it's only one of multiple canons that have existed over the course of time. And I'm not exclusively referring to the KJV, but any version containing the 66 books, the NIV, NCV, NASB. And so I've noticed that different people are willing to accept certain amounts of textual corruption, but only to a certain level of consideration. Even among the biblical vegan communities, people are at different levels. Some people don't even look into this. This is the documentary hypothesis. That's what it's called. That's what we're about to look at. And a lot of people, they just learn how to interpret the Bible. A lot of vegans just learn how to interpret the Bible in the context of Genesis chapter 1. And that's perfectly fine. That's what most of shifting the Torah paradigm does. It learns how, it shows you how to interpret the Bible based on the context of Genesis chapter 1, which is how you're supposed to do it anyway. I mean, go in chronological order. Don't bring something that happened 3,000 years later, pull it into Genesis chapter 1, and then pull the same thing into, you can't just mix and match. It's not a Pulp Fiction movie where you're allowed to watch certain parts of the story out of order. Okay, it's not like that. All right. Anyway, yeah, I believe we can understand the Bible, the entire Bible, if we first understand the context of creation, using the concessionist approach. Okay, but textual corruption is very real. And I like what Dr. Shmuel Asher says about animal sacrifice. It's a system that originated in pagan culture and half-truths while being proliferated through manipulated texts, junk science, and so-called kosher production cleansing procedures. All right? So in other words, like many other contemporary doctrines, the practice of eating animal flesh, the practice of animal sacrifice, rather, and meat consumption, it began with men who desired animal flesh and endeavored to supplement this belief system into their religious practices by strategically tampering with the texts, okay? And it's commonly admitted that the very last or most recent addition to the Bible was the sacrificial system and the Levitical system, as we know about it. It was written into the text by an elite society of flesh-hungry, bloodthirsty animal eaters to endorse their behavior and depict it as divine requirement. All right? So the name of Yahweh and usage of the title God. This is big in understanding this. It does cause one to question whether Moses simply used the name sometimes and the title God in other places. Or if we're dealing with various writers who used different titles or references to the Creator, okay? And when you consider not just one point, but a lot of these points, it becomes more plausible to consider that the books of Moses are not just, they're not Mosaic at all, or at least not as Mosaic as we have traditionally believed. The narrative within the book of Genesis appears to have been written by separate sources who cut and pasted different versions of the same story. And in the broad scope, there are 4 recognized sources for the collection that we know as the Torah or the Pentateuch. And this is the JEDP source theory, and that's what recognizes these. And I'll pull it up on the screen for you to see. And here it is. Okay, this one. All right, so the J source, the Yahwist source, recognized by its usage of the name Jehovah or Yahweh. Many people understand that English Bibles render his name as Lord. The J writer never uses the title God or El when referring to the Creator. The E source is the El source or the God source. He refers to the Creator as God throughout the text, okay? And then there's the D source, Deuteronomic source, recognized as the writer of the book of Deuteronomy, solely as and mostly as that's what he wrote. And then the P source was the priestly source, basically wrote the book of Leviticus and a few other parts that were cut and pasted into these other sources texts. All right, so there's that. So in the simplest terms, the books of Genesis, Exodus, and Numbers, they're believed to reveal a composite collection made possible by 3 different parties, J, E, and the P sources. The book of Leviticus was exclusively written by the P source, and Deuteronomy was primarily written by the D source. Okay, so this is the JEDP source theory. And it eventually became known as the documentary hypothesis, what I mentioned a few minutes ago. And it's no doubt a process of higher criticism, as Friedman calls it. Many people believe it is an attempt to refute the legitimacy of the Bible, but it's not. That's not what we're here to do. We're not here to disprove the Bible. It's about knowing who wrote it. That's it. And at the same time, we have to question the motive of certain parties involved. And several arguments have been formed against this line of investigation, and many people have been criticized for even considering authorship other than Moses. And the 4 sources that I just read They account for authorship, but they don't identify the party who compiled those documents. And that party is known as the redactor or the revisionist. And he basically finalized, he was the editor who finalized everything and then published this final copy and by cutting, copying, and pasting. The redactor, he arranged what is known as the Torah. But prior to his involvement, there were 4 original sources around different times that can be recognized by their literary style, their terminology, and clues that lead us to the time and place of authorship. Okay. Sorry if this video is a little more dry than most. It's going to be another long video. I'm sorry. And it's going to require some thinking. Even I'm going to have a hard time concentrating on what I wrote and the notes because it's just such an intricate study. And so it's like I said, it might be dry and it might be a little more boring than most videos, but if you want to know who wrote the Bible, that's what we're here to do. Prior to this redactor's involvement, there were 4 original sources, and they were recognized by their literary style, the terminology, and certain clues that lead us to the time and place of their authorship. Okay, the twofold count of creation, for instance, that can be separated in 2 different source categories. Narrative 1, that's Genesis 1, and narrative 2, Genesis 2. All right. And even though we commonly read the 2nd chapter of Genesis as if it were an expansion of the 1st chapter, the text appears to repeat itself and list a different order of creation. Okay, so that's just one of those flags that was raised in this line of research. In chapter 3, when I talk about Genesis, I mostly read from Genesis chapter 1. So, and that's where we read that God created plants, animals, and humans in that order. But according to Genesis chapter 2, the order's rearranged. It lists man, plants, animals, and then the woman. So we have at least a good enough reason to consider the idea that these are 2 separate accounts that were compiled into one book. Okay, I think that's fair. Other places in Genesis appear to be more composite than separate. Like Genesis 1, like I just said, Genesis 1 appears to be written by one party, and then Genesis 2 by a separate party. Just 2 different works. But there are places that look to be more cut and pasted by different parties in the same text, okay? The story of Noah, it's more of an interwoven narrative with bits and pieces of text from both sources compiled together throughout chapter 6, 7, and 8. And his story is, it's like a combination of a few J documents and P documents where the animals are categorized differently. And one writer describes pairs of animals. The other makes a distinction between the clean and the unclean animals. And what helps to identify both sources are the name designations, Yahweh and God. And I like Friedman's book because he breaks it down and shows you exactly which, in the story of Noah, which verses were written by the J source and which ones were written by the P source. Okay, so and there are a few differences between the J source and the E source, like the Ark of the Covenant, and that's one highlight of the J documents, but it's never mentioned in the narrative that is identified to have been written by the E source, the L source. Okay, the Tent of Meeting is one focal point of the E documents, but it's never mentioned in the J narrative. And like he says, the stories in the sources treat the religious symbols of the respective communities from which they came. And that's big in identifying who each party was. Further investigation. You have to look at each writer's background, and that's what ultimately reveals why the differences are significant to their placement. Okay. And I find it interesting that Friedman, in his book, he pinpoints the golden calf incident as one of the more revealing chapters in our Bible. And that's interesting because there's much debate as to the nature of worship behind the golden calf. And in chapter 5, I stated my position on the subject. I went over this in the video series about Moses, the Passover Paradigm series. And, some people believe the Israelites were worshiping Yahweh because Aaron said, tomorrow is a feast to Yahweh. So other people, myself included, I have recognized that the text is more focused on false gods. And this is another thing that exposes the Israelites for being wicked. Okay, they were saying, make us gods. These be thy gods. Okay, and so what you have here is, this is a place where that story could have been a composite work. And so it becomes questionable why there appear to be two versions of the story within the narrative. And the entire story is just subject to question when you consider why the writers described such a defiant group of people in that monumental event of deliverance and receiving the covenant. Okay, I've always questioned what was really happening in this story, and I've tried to figure out the relationship between each party involved and what their disconnect was with each other. There's 5 parties involved: Yahweh, Moses, Aaron, the Israelites, and then false gods. So the reader has to figure out the relationship between each one. All right, what are their motives? What's their focus? And so at the very least, we should be willing to admit how confusing that story appears on the surface. And that's why there's so much debate on the matter. It's because we're getting multiple plots combined into one story from different writers, okay? It's just another example of conflicting details within that single narrative, supposedly written by one author, okay? As far as the historical placement of the first 2 sources, the J source and the E source, the Yahwists and the L source, they were descendants of Jacob, okay? They came much later in the story, and more specifically, the J source came from the southern kingdom of Judah, and the E source came from the northern kingdom of Israel, both from the time period just before Assyria invaded Israel. All right, the placement of both writers. It's significant because certain clues reveal the Yahwists are more focused on the concerns of Judah, the southern kingdom, while the L party is more focused on Israel, the northern kingdom affairs, okay? And sometimes the narrative favors Judah, and sometimes it favors northern Israel, all right? But overall, both writers shared the same heritage throughout their deliverance from Egypt. And that's what ensures that neither party could have fabricated the stories. Okay, so this is good. We're trusting what they have written. Okay, it reinforces why both stories can be interwoven together to form that single narrative in the first few books of the Bible. And there may be differences in detail, but the storyline itself is consistent. Both sources, J and E, they were descendants of Israel. They were relatives who spoke the same language. They worshiped the same God. And because of their shared interest, both of their documents would greatly contribute to each other's story if they were combined into one. So the story, it doesn't end there. The plot thickens. This gets pretty deep here as soon as we take a look at what it says in 2 Kings. All right. Now I blow it up too much. Let me get that on the screen for you guys. Oh, sorry. It's taking me a minute. Hilkiah, the high priest, said to Shaphan, the secretary, I have found the book of the law in the house of the Lord. And Hilkiah gave the book to Shaphan. He read it. Shaphan, the secretary, told the king, Hilkiah, the priest, has given me a book. Shaphan read it before the king. When the king heard the words of the book of the law, he tore his clothes. The king commanded Hilkiah the priest and Ahikam, that guy, the son of Shaphan, and Achbor, the son of Micaiah, and Shaphan the secretary, and Asaiah the king's servant, saying, Go, inquire of the Lord for me and for the people, for all Judah, concerning the words of this book that has been found. For great is the wrath of the Lord that is kindled against us, because our fathers have not obeyed the words of this book, to do according to all that is written concerning us. Okay. What's going on here, guys? The book of the law, it was none other than Deuteronomy. That's what they're talking about, okay? And a lot of people assume that it was a compilation of the first 5 books of Moses. They think it includes all these Levitical laws and these animal sacrifices and things like that. It was the single work of the D source, okay? The party who wrote Deuteronomy. And as it turns out, the time frame in which the book of law was written is estimated more recently, during the days of King Josiah's reign. It was around the same time that the next successive books of the Bible were written: Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. It's the same party who wrote Deuteronomy. He wrote the next 6 books. This is, people conclude that because the strong linguistic similarities between those books and the continuity in narration, as if the stories were arranged by one person, okay? And it was a collection, it was a history from the time of Moses' death to the fall of Judah when they entered Babylonian captivity. And because multiple similarities between Deuteronomy and the following 6 books, except for Ruth, we can narrow down the time frame to Josiah's reign, all right? And these similarities include phrases attributed to Moses and Josiah, such as, none arose like him, and loving Yahweh with all your heart, soul, and strength. And it's the only time we see the phraseology, book of the law, okay? Remember, I was talking about the book of the law when I talk about the story of Moses when he's on his deathbed. We talked about that. I opened up with it in yesterday's video. And that's why I opened up the doors for textual corruption, okay? In Joshua, Deuteronomy and Joshua, but it's that phrase is book of the law. It's in Deuteronomy and Joshua, but never again until nearly 600 years later when Josiah enters the scene. And the public reading of the book of the law is only mentioned within Deuteronomy, and then again in the story of Josiah, okay? The smashing of the golden calf in Moses' story, it's described in the same terms as Josiah's destruction of the altar and high places in Bethel, something to the effect of being smashed into dust or smashed into powder. There are similarities that are more than just a natural part of your vocabulary. Those books, they're believed to be 600 years apart. And so they should have, they should reflect language that, figures of speech that favorable to their times anyway, and not the same type of language, right? But like they point out, the text appears to have been written and compiled by someone within a much smaller time gap, perhaps the same generation or the same person. There are parallels between Moses and Josiah that place the writer of Deuteronomy in the following 6 books during the time of Josiah's reign. Okay, subsequent to Josiah's reign, the theme of centralized religion is no longer seen. Remember how we talked about this? If you're going to sacrifice, do it in the place where I command you. If you do it outside of the camp, then you're guilty of bloodshed. They had to do it here and here only, and by these priests. And that's the belief system on which the Israelites stood. Their fate rested upon how consistently their behavior aligned with the commands of that book of law, the book of the law. So among many other insights, that's the basis of this whole analysis, is that Deuteronomy was the single book of the law described in 2 Kings. Okay, it was written by someone during Josiah's reign, and the narrative seems to be written by a Levite author, all right, most likely a priest of Shiloh during the reign of Josiah. It favors the Levites above all others, okay? And it caters to their interests, lifestyles, and income, right? It places them higher on that social ladder because they were given special privileges. They outweighed all other tribes. They were special people. The Levites took advantage of that. Okay, so Hilkiah, like that verse we read, Hilkiah was the priest that found the book of the law. Remember? This was during Josiah's reign. Shaphan was the scribe who brought it to Josiah. Jeremiah was a prophet during the reign of Josiah. People say, oh, Jeremiah has nothing to do with it. The lying pen of the scribes, people are just using that. Well, it just so happens that the time frame in which he existed is during this canonization of the Torah, when it's all coming together, right? So, yeah, but it's just a coincidence. The lying pen of the scribes who made God's law into a lie, oh, that has nothing to do with anything. Whatever. The Shiloh connection, it's seen in the book of Jeremiah. And Jeremiah 1:1, okay? He mentions this place multiple times. We'll get to Jeremiah 1:1 in a second, but Jeremiah was the prophet during the reign of Josiah, which by default connects him to the book of the law by affiliation. Just simply, that's the way it is. What's interesting about the connection is the strong indication that Hilkiah, the priest, was the same Hilkiah of the priests, identified as Jeremiah's father in the opening of his book, Jeremiah 1:1. It says the words of Jeremiah, the son of Hilkiah of the priests that were in Anathoth in the land of Benjamin, to whom the word of the Lord came in the days of Josiah, the son of Amon, king of Judah, in the 13th year of his reign. So it's not coincidence that Jeremiah is here during this time. It's not a coincidence that he is the prophet who exposed the lying pen of the scribes. Time frame wise, he's here when we start to see all this happening, where the books are starting to appear in the compiling of the scriptures, okay, the Torah. Multiple details here. And that's what leads scholars to believe the author of Deuteronomy is within that same time frame and circle of writers of those other books, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings. And so when a writer compiles data into a single manuscript, he focuses on, and he often repeats the details that have made an impact and shaped his understanding. He brings out aspects of the story that he believes will be retained by the reader, or even will influence his reader's decision about a certain topic. And the phrases that you'll see in his books are repeated. It links things together. People, places, events, the same idioms of speech, like if you hearken diligently to Yahweh's voice, used quite a bit. Circumcise the foreskin of your hearts, is seen a couple times. To all the hosts of heaven. And we brought you out from the iron furnace. There are just phrases like that can link these books together. Okay? There's similarities between Deuteronomy and Jeremiah that indicate that the writer of these books was proximal to both the time and location. It's what establishes that the book of Jeremiah itself, or some of it, was a part of this collection of Deuteronomistic history. And it was completed by the same party. So the D source has been identified as a Shilonite priest who valued his heritage so much as to preserve it through these writings. His appreciation for literature was an ongoing tradition that influenced him to preserve his heritage through the texts that we know today. The Deuteronomist began his narrative with a historical account of Moses. He walked his readers through this period of history that led to the generation of the author himself, Josiah's reign. That's where we see multiple dynamics colliding together to reveal that it was during Josiah's generation, his time frame, the placement of the writer himself. He talked about Israel, their deliverance, the laws in Deuteronomy, their victorious conquests in Joshua, the early settlers in the land that they acquired in Judges, the accession history of the first kings, the significance of Shiloh, like it is in 1 Samuel, the court history of David, that's 2 Samuel, the succession history of the kings that led to the time frame of the writer, that's 1st and 2nd Kings. And some people might argue that the time frame is a little off. It had to extend further just because the last 2 chapters of 2 Kings occurred after Josiah's death. But it doesn't mean anything. It just means Josiah just happened to die before the writer himself died. So he was able to extend that history a generation after Josiah. So not a big deal. That the identity of this person who wrote Deuteronomy is none other than Baruch. A lot of people know that name, Baruch, the son of Neriah. Baruch, he was in the right place at the right time. He was a priest of the priests of Shiloh, Anathoth. He was in Jerusalem during the reign of Josiah when the first edition of Deuteronomy was produced. He was in Egypt after the destruction and exile when the second issue was produced. And his book is filled with language of the Deuteronomistic history, the same favorite terms and phrases, what we see throughout the books, the same metaphors, the same point of view on practically every important point. All right. So Baruch, it's not a name that people normally recognize in the mainstream Christian community, and even in the Torah community. He commonly goes unnoticed, but interestingly, in his self-titled book, First Baruch, we see the same reference to the book of the law that was previously found, and that's in chapter 4, verse 1. All right. And I found that to be more supportive, that he uses that phrase, book of the law. I believe it was Baruch. I believe this guy is right. And as much as I suspected Jeremiah, that's who I kept thinking he was going to say. It's Jeremiah wrote the book. I was surprised to learn that he identified him as Baruch. He was a more probable candidate for the D document. Okay. And that's not to say that Baruch wrote his version of history completely from scratch. The Deuteronomistic historian, as Friedman says, he built his history around the Deuteronomic law, the code, which was an authentically old document in which he may well have been believed to be by Moses himself. So what Baruch wrote was based off of Moses's writing, most likely, okay? And he likely used a combination of writings that he believed were credible for the basis of his story while adapting the information to his own narrative. And like a practical comparison is how I compiled Shifting the Torah Paradigm, how it was arranged. I've included information from many different writers that are valuable enough to me to outline an entire publication about a hidden storyline within the biblical narrative. And most of the commentary is my own, but there are numerous inclusions from other sources. And Baruch's work is it's essentially the same. He wrote an entire narrative that emphasized certain highlights taken from known sources during that time. Most likely the source of written by Moses himself. Okay, so the last party here is the P source, and he's responsible for the majority of the Pentateuch. And earlier in maybe in my videos, or at least I know in the book, I discussed centralization of worship. And I think I talked about this in chapter 5, when I talk about Moses and the flesh pots, that is one place. And the flesh pots continued, which is the moral nature of God. God is vegan. Look up. They're in there somewhere. If you want to know which videos I talk about centralized worship, just get a hold of me. Whether the animal was permitted to be sacrificed in one location or whether they were allowed to sacrifice just anywhere. Okay, this is kind of a big deal because it shows you that, hey, maybe it was actually two authors, which I believe to be the case now, two different authors who had different motives wanting to sacrifice just anywhere. That's why there's a debate, is because we're getting two sides of the story, all right? According to most researchers among the documentary hypothesis community, the J and E sources account for the passages that speak of unrestricted sacrifice, okay? But the D source, written by Baruch, he's made it abundantly clear that Israel must worship or sacrifice only in the place that Yahweh causes his name to dwell. Hey, that's huge, guys. I mean, it's big, all right? People want to just blow this topic off like, oh, we're allowed to kill animals and eat them at our discretion, especially if it's for food. We're not breaking Torah. Man, I can show you some videos that prove you are violating Torah. Just buy a Chubba hamburger in the store, you violated Torah right there. If you want to know how that meat made its way to your plate, my gosh. And see, there's differences between the P source and the D source. It's been suggested that they were distant cousins, all right? D coming from the Mushites, the descendants of Moses, and P are from the descendants of Aaron. So the people who, the Deuteronomic source versus the priest, the Levite source, the priestly source. So we're looking at two different perspectives relative to family line, okay? And it's significant because some writings portray only some Levites as legitimate as opposed to all Levite descendants. So if it wasn't bad enough that the Levites themselves were this elite group of wicked priests, it's even, they put these specifically, the sons of Zadok, who alone among the sons of Levi, that they may come near Yahweh to minister to him. So we got these guys who are even more special, okay? And I referenced the book of Ezekiel because just as there were identifiable similarities between the book of Jeremiah and the D documents, the same thing is going on with Ezekiel and the P documents, all right? And at one time, popular ideology among the documentary hypothesis was that because there was no mention of the temple within the priestly documents, it gave rise to the suspicion of that the tabernacle was invented just for the purpose of typifying the temple, that it didn't really exist. And Yahweh never commanded them to build a temple once they arrived at their destination. I do think it's kind of odd that why would he excuse me, why would he require the skins of multiple animals to be stretched over? I mean, that many dead animals just to build a hut to sacrifice even more animals. I think there's more to that story too. Anyway, according to this, what we're looking at now, what they believed was going on, since Yahweh never commanded the people to build a temple once they arrived at their destination. Remember, that was what David wanted to do. That's what Solomon ended up doing. So there was a missing link there. The tabernacle was that link, all right? According to Friedman's whole layout, the tabernacle is only mentioned 3 times in the E source. It's never mentioned in the J documents or the D documents. So this is why certain scholars considered it to be an invention of the priestly community, a fiction made up by someone living in the days of the Second Temple. That's what they thought. Okay, since Yahweh never commanded Moses to build a temple, the writer devised a solution to the modern temple activity. and that was the tabernacle. And that's what would further solidify that the priestly laws came from Moses himself, all right? And so we have a seemingly authoritative account of Moses being commanded to build a tabernacle along with corresponding sacrificial laws, which foreshadowed the future temple. That's what's happening. And so from the priestly writer's perspective, this account was the perfect narrative to validate the behavior of their sacred rituals. And so, in other words, it was a literary and legal fiction created by the post-exile author or authors of P to support and rebuild the temple and the reestablished priesthood in Jerusalem of their day. All right, the P source, it made inclusions that none other sources knew about, such as the sin offering and the guilt offerings. And that's the thing. The book of Leviticus, my gosh, it's where all the sacrifices happening. Now, there's still some morbid stuff in the other books, which I believe is where the lying pen of the scribes has also been a part of that agenda. Okay, the P source is responsible for the entire book of Leviticus. We get that. That's who the priests, they wrote the book of Leviticus. So different kinds of sacrifice, animals, the how-to instructions, and of course, because since so many people believe that the Bible is the infallible word of God, the laws in Leviticus are believed to reinforce the legitimacy of animal sacrifice. It's like in their minds, it's what Yahweh commanded Moses in Mount Sinai. Okay. However, you see, the problem though is that Jeremiah spoke against the sacrifices, and it was directly against the P source. This is what I'm getting. Jeremiah 7:22. For in the day I brought them out of the land of Egypt, I did not speak to their fathers or command them concerning burnt offerings and sacrifices. He's exposing that. Okay? And people want to say, well, Jeremiah's words don't have anything to do with veganism. And you're just using the lying pen of the scribes. Well, it's like here, he directly points them out for their sacrifices. You don't think that there's a connection there? Jeremiah happened to be in the same time frame as a lot of when this Bible writing was going on. Okay? And people, they contend that certain passages, such as Jeremiah, they're taken out of context to support an anti-sacrificial view. It's not what we're doing. I believe Jeremiah establishes an even stronger context for our position. Don't you? I do. If nothing else, it reaffirms the conflict between the opposing parties at the time. And for a time, it was concluded that the P source came from the Second Temple period after Ezekiel spoke of the Zadokite priesthood being restored. All right. It was a time when Israel felt guilty because their exile was the result of their sins. But Friedman here, he believed there were clues as to why the writer would have only been familiar with the first temple. To him, it was the tabernacle. That was more than just a typological figure. He believed it was real, but it was a literal tent that was eventually kept inside the first temple itself. And he references 1 Kings 8:4. They brought the ark of the Lord, the tent of meeting, and all the holy vessels that were in the tent. The priests and the Levites brought them up. Okay, in 2 Chronicles 5:5, it says they brought up the ark, the tent of meeting, and the holy vessels that were in the tent, and the Levites brought them up, right? And he even talks about two other, let's see, let's look at these. Where are these from? 528 and 529. Jewish Antiquities, Book 4 by Josephus, and then the Babylonian Talmud. He's got two references here. Josephus says they carried the ark in the tabernacle, which Moses had pitched, and all the vessels that were for ministration to the sacrifices of God, and he removed them to the temple. And then in the Talmud, it says that when the first temple was built, the tent of meeting was sequestered. I've never used that word, including its boards, its clasps, its bars, its pillars, beneath the tunnels of the sanctuary. So they were keeping this tent in in the temple. All right. So the P source, the writer, he must have lived before the first temple was destroyed, when centralized worship was heavily emphasized. It was a time when the tabernacle was stored inside the temple before it burned down. Okay. And so if all the sacrifices were to be done in the place of worship, the writer would have documented according to that standard. All right. So why would a priest write a law code that said sacrifices can only be offered at a place that didn't exist anymore? Right. So that's makes sense. The place of origin for the P document was likely Jerusalem, the time frame prior to the fall of Jerusalem, 587 BC, and the family ties were within the priestly line of Aaron. All right. The P source, he was familiar with the J and E texts, and he piggybacked off those sources, but not to add to the narrative. It was meant to replace it. He wanted to replace their narrative with his own. And when the refugees from the northern kingdom came down to Judah, they would have brought the E documents with them, and that would have become part of the same library where the J documents were kept. And the problem is that neither document emphasizes the role of a priest. Okay, they speak of a prophet. Okay, since Aaronic priests now have a version of history that is silent about their sacrificial behaviors, they begin to journal a historical paradigm of their own. All right, the P documents. The writer, he's careful to attribute sacrificial rites exclusively to Aaron's priestly line. And the J and E sources, they were the ones talking about previous generations who sacrificed, like Cain and Abel, Abraham. And if you recall, the J version of the story of Noah records 7 pairs of clean animals, but the P version lists only 2 of every animal. All right. And the reason's because the concentration of Aaron was the first time animal sacrifice was portrayed in the P version of history. So even though sacrifice was highlighted for the priestly line, the priestly narrative, it was not their primary concern. It was more about emphasizing the role of a priest. Okay, we're getting there. I'm wrapping up now. I got a few more pages of notes to go through. No, I'm not wrapping up. I will probably go another 20 minutes. But I feel like the priestly source, it's the most disappointing. It paints a distorted image of the creator. It portrays him as one who only forgives people who are willing to spill blood and pay tribute to Aaronite priests. Not something God commanded, something they invented. The other sources portrayed God as one who freely forgives his people when they're truly repentant. So J and E's picture looks like a real father-child relationship, while the P image resembles the pagan gods who demanded blood ritual. The priests, they just lined up with pagan nations. They lined up with occult rituals. That's just their behavior. That's what they wrote into the text. They're concerned with status and recognition, emphasizing their position of honor. And that was the priestly order and the sacrificial system. And if that weren't enough, if it weren't enough that Jeremiah exposed animal sacrifice as human institution, he challenged the writers that he believed were responsible for making it a divine requirement. That's where Jeremiah 8:8 comes in. The lying pen of the scribes has turned the law of God into a lie. He's not talking about Deuteronomy. He's talking about the priestly source who wrote the book of Leviticus, the priestly documents. They were produced during the reign of King Hezekiah, who was responsible for appointing the divisions of the priests and of the Levites, the divisions by divisions, each according to his service, for burnt offerings and peace offerings, to minister in the gates of the camp of Yahweh. That's the same man who smashed one of the most iconic symbols of power, Moses' bronze serpent. Hezekiah, read that in 2 Kings 18:4. Some of the king's favored Aaron and others favored Moses. All right. Solomon removed the priest at Shiloh. He transferred the power to Aaron's descendant Zadok. King Hezekiah simply followed suit. Josiah, on the other hand, worked in favor of Moses by defiling Solomon's altars. And when comparing the D and P documents, we find that the Deuteronomic source aligns with the heartbeat of Josiah, while the priestly source aligns with the motives of Hezekiah. So we got different motives, different things aligning with different kings. And there were common threads that tie the book of Deuteronomy with 1 Kings and 2 Kings. And the same goes with the priestly source, tying the books of Chronicles together with the priestly source. Okay. So the P source is pinpointed to the time prior to the fall of Jerusalem. He was a descendant of Aaron. His documents produced a conscious effort to challenge J and E's work. Okay, like I said, it was meant to replace those books. So he was possibly someone that would compile everything. He didn't think that they were going to compile everything in one book. He didn't know the redactor would come into the picture. So the P source, they don't identify him by name, just that he was someone among that line. If anyone knows about the books of the Bible, if you know anything, if you have ever read about this time in history, then you'll know the name Ezra. That's a book of the Bible, okay? Ezra, Nehemiah, that's right, remember? Ezra is the Aaronite priest who is responsible for what we know as Torah. He's the redactor. He's the one who compiled everything together. He is responsible for the 5 books of Moses. He was an Aaronite priest. He favored the priestly party enough to emphasize the P documents as the primary source within that collection. And I'm sitting here, bashing on these Aaronite priests, the priestly sources, and Ezra just happens to be one. Okay, it doesn't mean that I'm saying that Ezra was evil. It says in Ezra 7:6, Ezra went up from Babylon. He was a ready scribe in the law of Moses, which the Lord God of Israel had given. The king granted him all his requests according to the hand of the Lord his God upon him. Okay, all 4 sources, the J, E, D, and P sources, were completed prior to the time of the Second Temple. But the redactor, Ezra, came in during the days of the Second Temple. And there are clues that place him in that time frame. Numbers chapter 15 is one clue. It's disruptive to the text. It's a list of laws wedged right in the middle of a story of spies and their revolt. Okay? It dealt with laws that were already established in Leviticus chapters 1-7, like sacrifices. Okay? Also, the tabernacle is mentioned nearly 100 times in the book of Numbers, but not in chapter 15. It's like that chapter is squeezed right in the middle of Numbers, and possibly written by Ezra, okay? Or at least he cut and pasted and stuck it right in there. It's mentioned in every single chapter preceding and every chapter following. That's all, that tabernacle, considering how vital the tabernacle would have been for sacrifice and centralized religion. So it was concluded that Numbers chapter 15 was an addition to the text, aside from the standard revisions that a redactor would have made. Okay? Clues that reveal the Pentateuch, Genesis 1 through Deuteronomy 34, that it was the final product of a composite work. That's just people, they put all these clues together, and that's what they conclude, that Ezra seems to be the best fit for the identity of the redactor. It was a classic case of being in the right place at the right time, having an authoritative position and access to all the right resources. He was a ready scribe in the law of Moses. He had prepared his heart to seek out Yahweh's Torah. So King Artaxerxes, he even recognized Ezra as one who carried the law of God. And that's what he wrote in his letter to Ezra. Artaxerxes, the king of kings, to Ezra, the priest, the scribe of the law of God. And he concludes that with, according to the law of your God, which is in your hand. Ezra 7, verses 12 through 14. Okay, so there are more sources recognizing Ezra as the final hand in the books of Moses, like Jerome, who addressed the dispute about the authorship, and he admitted that he had no objection to calling Ezra the renewer of the Pentateuch. Okay, but there's a great deal of suspicion among these scholars, different people who investigate this, that Ezra is responsible for the collection that we traditionally accept as being Mosaic. Even in the fourth book of Ezra, which is 2nd Ezra's 14, 20, and 21, same suggestion. It says, your law has been burned, so no one knows the things which have been done or will be done by you. If then I have found favor with you, send the Holy Spirit into me, and I will write everything that has happened in the world from beginning, the things that were written in your law, so the people may be able to find the path, and that those who want to live in the last days may do so. Okay, Ezra, he compiled the JEDP sources into one collection. He used the most recognized sources that existed during his day. But instead of lost my place. Okay, there it is. Instead of compiling them together in a single parallel, side by side, like the Gospels, he could have just put these works together and had 4 different works like the Gospels, and maybe even had his own thoughts that he could have added as a 5th writing. What he did was he cut and pasted everything into one compilation to complete this task. He became a revisionist. And that's not a simple task. It was more than an editor. It was more than a spell check assignment, guys. He had to correct places that he felt needed corrected. He had to make their narratives harmonize as much as possible. And he did so by adding his own inclusions to the text. I can't even begin to think, I've written 4 books, and I can't even begin to imagine a project like that. Okay? I do enough of that just writing the books. So in Ezra's case, how do you do something like this without running into places where the text contradicts or repeats itself? And I like what Friedman says, because he just basically comes out and says that he kind of let some things slip through the cracks. For instance, he was not prepared to have 2 floods that each destroy all the world except for a man named Noah. There are different accounts that we talked about this. The story of Moses is a composite work by 2 different writers that he cut and pasted and put together. And so Ezra didn't want 2 different flood stories, but he was willing to have Moses strike 2 rocks in 2 different places at Meribah. Different things like that. Some places depict Moses doing things twice, whereas other stories, there was only one event. Okay, so the redactor's texts were diverse and complicated, and he was wise enough and skillful enough to handle each case according to his own judgment of what it needed. Okay, so the redactor was artistic. He was more creative than any of the original sources themselves. His efforts required more planning than all the other writers. But what none of these contributing parties could have imagined, and this is where things are this is where the rubber meets the road, guys. The rubber meets the road. I know this went on for longer too. I'm sorry about that, but here's where we're getting to what you guys probably want to know. It's basically, I'm concluding everything. What none of these contributing parties could have imagined was the impact that Ezra's final product would have on future generations. Their work created multiple religious paradigms depending on one's interpretation of the text, beginning with the misconception that Moses himself was the author. So unbeknownst to the reader, any conclusions that we form from the Pentateuch, from the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, would be the product of multiple worldviews, not just Moshe's worldview, and more consequently, multiple concepts of God, not just Moses's concept of God. Okay, multiple concepts of God. That's why we read about 2 different gods. You read about a life-giving creator in Genesis 1, and then you read about a bloodthirsty savage in Exodus 29 who demands blood to initiate priests and forgive your sins. It doesn't line up. We have multiple parties depicting God differently. That's the point, guys. And if you don't think that this is real, or that we're dealing with multiple parties who had agendas, then you're naive. You need to snap out of it and just come to grips with the fact that the product that the Catholic Church gave you, that product, that leather-bound KJV that you're holding in your hand, is not the infallible Word of God, guys. Okay? You need to get that before anything. Understand that it's been manipulated, all right? The documentary hypothesis, that's what this is. This is paramount to your study, guys. It's remarkable that such a school of research has existed over the course of time, and it's rarely talked about. Okay, even among the Christian and Torah truther communities, that at least the people that I'm affiliated with, I've never heard this line of investigation until I began researching biblical veganism, and it led me to that, and it led me to learn about more of the writers of the Bible. And I've tried to be cautious in my book and even on the videos because I don't want to misrepresent Friedman's work, because he didn't do it to prove veganism or anything like that. I just think that his research just really helps out to understand what was going on. His investigation, it only addresses the parties responsible for the books of Torah. It's not meant to. I'm not trying to encourage my viewers or my readers to deny the integrity of the Bible or anything like that, but we have to be vigilant. We have to understand that what we read is not an exact account of what happened. Okay, so where's the disconnect? Excuse me. Was animal sacrifice instituted as a matter of God's concession to human weakness, or was it a matter of textual corruption? And I think it's both. All right. There are possibilities for interpretation that I shared throughout the book that I believe are legitimate. Israel demanded animal flesh, so they devised a way to satisfy their lust. They knew animal sacrifice was wicked, but if they redirected that form of worship to Yahweh, then it would just seem to justify the practice itself, all right? By turning sacrifice into a religious sacrament like substitutionary atonement, they bring that into it. It would not only validate their behavior, it would also reestablish the procedure as a requirement, all right? And so in turn, they can enjoy the guiltless pleasure of eating animal flesh while convincing themselves that God Almighty approves, and when in fact he reluctantly tolerated their behavior. So in future generations, when the JED and P source and the redactor entered the scene, the writers had already accepted these religious traditions as a part of their Torah paradigm. There were already practices that they were doing anyway. So when you take that along with their own agendas, things to make like the Aaronite priests wanting themselves to be the highest social class among the Israelites and the chosen vessels, the priests, then things start to make sense. Okay. If any of these sources originally documented an occasion of sacrifice, it was only because it was already accepted as a requirement of Yahweh. That, like traditionally through oral tradition, that's why it was just became a part of their lifestyle. their religious customs. And so that's how it was recorded. And I'm willing to give all four sources the benefit of the doubt and just say that they could have been following tradition. They never would have guessed that their heritage was nothing more than a pagan culture that was adopted from the nations. Maybe they just didn't know. It's like people today who accept pagan tradition just out of tradition. They just don't know. Now, even though I say that, I give them the benefit of the doubt. There is always a corrupt line of Levites, elites. There are always people in charge who know what's going on. And that, it doesn't matter. I mean, people know what's going on. People know the truth. People in charge, leaderships, they know what's going on. They know the darker reality of something. So I don't know. But for the people who didn't know, it'd be just like pastors today who they don't really question their upbringing. They just carry on the tradition. They become a pastor in their father's place, and they just do things the way they've always done. No questions asked. And it was no different when Ezra compiled the work. Okay, just like most people today, they accept that God established animal sacrifice. It demonstrates how susceptible we are to inherit lies of former generations. It's just, we think, oh, that was just a part of what God wanted. But we cannot dismiss that Jeremiah felt strongly about the lying pen of the scribes and what was going on during his time. Okay, somewhere in the mix, the narrative evolved, whether it was through the original sources themselves or later generations of scribes. By the time Yeshua entered the scene, he was aware of the hypocrisy of the scribes in so much that he reprimanded them along with the Pharisees for diminishing the commands of God by keeping their man-made doctrines, the same way that Jeremiah reprimanded the scribes. Okay? It's not a coincidence, guys. It's not out of context. No, we're actually believing the prophet for what he said. Anyway, knowing that mankind brings worldly traditions and customs into our religious paradigm, we have to be willing to use morality and logic when we read the Bible, just like Yeshua did. And if we do that, we can determine that some inclusions were never commanded by God. And the entire sacrificial system, that's the number one area of suspicion because it violates that righteous principle of life, compassion, and mercy. And it suggests that forgiveness was only made possible by mutilating an animal against its will and splattering its blood everywhere, all over sacred objects within a sacred space. And because this behavior reflects ancient blood rituals of pagan cultures, it does, we can rest assured that our Creator never required this from his people. Okay? So in sum, there I said it, in sum, it's difficult to express how intricate Friedman's book really is. And like I said, it's not a vegan book. It's just who wrote the Bible. I can't even begin to think that I did him justice in this one section, but really you just need to get the book. You just need to get the book, okay? So I added, and I'll show you, I'll share my screen. He has a chart in his book where he has pinpointed every book, scripture, chapter, and verse from the first 5 books and who wrote each chapter and verse, okay? I can't really validate everything, but I can just show you what he has pinpointed. And so we always got to allow a little bit of wiggle room here. So let me pull this up on the screen, and then I'm going to let you guys go because this has been a long one. Okay, the J source, and this is the book of Genesis, which parties were involved in writing the book of Genesis, and he's got it down to the chapter and verse. which I think is pretty impressive. Okay. The book of Exodus. Okay. See how the Deuteronomic source hasn't written anything. He was mostly responsible. And same with the book of Numbers. And then when we get to the book of Deuteronomy, there were apparently 2 editions, or written at 2 different times, revised. And he kind of goes over here. See these 2, the E and the P party had a little something to do with Deuteronomy, and then another source. And he talks about that in his book. So there it is. I'm sorry I went long again. I promise you the rest of the videos won't be this long. It'll be about half this, okay? So I know these first 2 videos in this series, they were just, this one especially was dry, just going through the whole thing. So there it is. We've got the hardest behind us now. So the rest will be a lot just quicker and to the point, and it'll just get you guys pointed in some directions for looking at some extra biblical sources to fill in the gaps. Okay, so thanks again for watching. I hope you enjoyed this, and I will talk to you next time.